Today is Thursday, April 25th, and this will be our last recording for Chapter 23, but we're not going to finish Chapter 23 today. We're just not going to have one for Friday because even 8th period is not meeting tomorrow because of the yearbook signing party. So today will be our last recording. Don't forget to turn in your Chapter 22 worksheet and your Chapter 22 SAQ that you should have already completed or be close to having done by now. So don't forget to turn those in tomorrow. Whatever we don't finish of Chapter 23 today, we will finish on Monday, and then you will have your Period 6 exam on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. So that will be a multiple choice exam and also an LEQ question. So you'll have a prompt and you will write an essay on that. All right. Today we're going to start with Che Guevara. So we've already mentioned that in some regions of the global south, especially in Latin America, there were some anti-globalization movements, anti-imperialist movements. And we're going to begin today with a video clip about Che Guevara. And we'll just start with the video and then we'll talk about it just a bit. And unfortunately, we've got to move right on along, so we got a lot to cover. So I'm just going to drag this over here and we'll start our video.
Che Guevara was a doctor, a revolutionary, and to the Latin American anti-establishment, a Christ-like martyr figure.
Ernesto Che Guevara was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, into a large upper-middle-class family. As a youth, he excelled in school and went on to study medicine at the University of Buenos Aires before graduating in 1953.
While Che was still a medical student, he traveled 5,000 miles through Latin America, observing the plight of the Latin American peasants.
He found poverty was widespread, and he blamed it on imperialism and capitalism. He determined that the solution to this was communism.
While in Guatemala in 1954, Guevara was incensed by the American-backed military coup of President Jacobo Arenz's socialist government. Later that year, Che met Fidel and Raul Castro while visiting Mexico and joined the revolutionary cause to overthrow the Batista government in Cuba.
He landed as the doctor for the invading force, but the invading force was quickly dispersed and lost most of its people, and Guevara switched from being the doctor to being a military man and ended up being Castro's second in command.
Following Castro's 1959 victory in the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara was instructed to round up and deal with former Batista officials.
Che Guevara organized hundreds of trials and put to death possibly 500 or even more Batista supporters.
The international community saw him as a murderer as a result of this. However, the Cuban people wanted most of these people to be killed for their crimes.
As one of the few people Fidel Castro trusted, Guevara was named head of the Ministry of Industry and the Cuban Bank.
Before Castro took charge in Cuba, it was really a capitalist economy. What Guevara did was he made the change to a communist system by turning over the land to the peasants and then nationalizing the banks and industry. Guevara advised Castro that he should align himself closer with the Soviet Union. In fact, it was Guevara who invited missiles into Cuba from the Soviet Union.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Guevara wanted the Soviets to attack the United States and openly criticized them for backing down. Castro, needing the Soviets as close allies, didn't like this and arranged for Guevara to leave Cuba.
Guevara in 1965 left Cuba in order to foment revolution in other areas of the world. He first went to the Congo, and then he went to Bolivia.
Che Guevara's stay in Bolivia was short-lived, and he was tracked down by the Bolivian army with the aid of the CIA and captured on October 7, 1967, and killed 2 days later.
Certainly, Che Guevara has a legacy as a Latin American revolutionary, but his most enduring legacy is his reduction in illiteracy in Cuba. and the formation of universities for everyone.
Today, Che Guevara remains a controversial figure, with his face gracing t-shirts worldwide as the symbol of anti-establishment and change.
Che Guevara is revered in Cuba today. You'll see him on a peso note. School children each day give a daily chant to him. The idea is that to be the ideal man or woman, you should be like Che.
Nice card, Billy.
All right, so we are going to move on from our video clip of Che Guevara, but of course we should think about him in the context of Fidel Castro and this link between Cuba and the Soviet Union, and leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis with the United States, that near use of nuclear weapons between the Soviet-backed Cubans and America. Alright, so now we will move forward into our discussion of globalization and feminism. And we've talked about some waves of feminism previously. The one that we will discuss today will be different in some specific ways. So feminism in the West, the momentum had decreased by the end of the 1920s, when many countries in Western Europe and North America had achieved women's suffrage. Now keep in mind that the 1920s wasn't an absolute for women getting the vote. In France, we don't see that happening until the 1940s. But many countries had achieved women's suffrage by that point. It's going to be revived. The movement's going to be revived in the 1960s in Western Europe and the United States, but with a different agenda than we saw before. So first of all, we have Simone de Beauvoir in 1949 writing and publishing the book The Second Sex. And there's an argument within that women had been defined as other or deviant from the normal, quote, normal male sex. French feminists countered the Mother's Day parade. They said it was celebrated one day and exploited all year. So just a statement on mothers only being celebrated that one token day a year when they work year-round. And 343 women signed a petition stating that they had undergone what was then an illegal abortion in France. The second instance we have in America, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. And this addressed the identity crisis of educated women who felt unfulfilled by marriage and motherhood. So this second wave feminism was there was an emphasis on education and employment, whereas the first wave was based more on women getting the vote. So women's liberation is a more radical expression of feminism. This is from a manifesto from 1969. We are exploited as sex objects, breeders, domestic servants, and cheap labor. We are considered inferior beings whose only purpose is to enhance men's lives. Because we live so intimately with our oppressors, we have been kept from seeing our own personal suffering as a political condition. There were protests at Miss America 1968. We have some female protesters tossing stink bombs into the hall of Miss America, and they even gathered to crown a live sheep as their choice for Miss America. They disposed of girdles, bras, high-heeled shoes, tweezers, and other so-called instruments of oppression in a freedom trash can. And it opened up this discussion about sexuality. Free love, lesbianism, celibacy should all have equal respect to heterosexual marriage. On the next slide, we see, if I can find how to get there, we can see some images from this Miss America protest. We see, welcome to the Miss America cattle auction, and we have this image of a woman who has been divided up as a cow would be divided up for butchering. So we see the different portions drawn onto her body. On the right side, we see women who are throwing undergarments into the freedom trash can. And Again, we've got stink bombs being tossed into the halls of Miss America, a live sheep being crowned as the protesters Miss America. So, the image of a sheep being a follower, in other words, being crowned as the beauty queen. As far as women of color, many women of color felt like white, usually middle-class feminist concerns weren't relevant to their own oppression, and many felt solidarity with men of color in a stronger focus on battling racism and battling poverty instead of some of the protests that we see from the white middle-class feminists, like the one you see on the screen here. So when we talk about feminism in the global South, it's going to look different than feminism in the global North. Feminism among impoverished regions has a different agenda. Their daily lives look different, and so the oppression looks different to them. To many African 1970s feminists, again, the concerns of American and European women were too focused on sexuality, individuality, motherhood, marriage, and poverty. They resented Western feminist interest in combating female genital mutilation and polygamy. So in other words, they resented people from the outside criticizing what was a cultural norm for many societies in Africa. In Kenya, 27,000 small associations of women were organized to help in times of need during weddings or births or funerals, and taking on community projects as needed. Water cisterns, schools, dispensaries, putting permanent iron roofing on homes. Also, there were these revolving loan societies that would help to buy land or businesses. And so we see an emphasis on feminism in the global South being geared to improving the community. One woman testifying to the empowerment she got from being a member of one of these small associations, she says, "I am a free woman. I bought this piece of land through my group. I can lie on it, work on it, keep goats or cows. What more do I want? My husband cannot sell it. It is mine." So just gaining that feeling of ownership over this piece of land was very significant to her. In Morocco, the family law code was targeted there. It still defined women as minors. In 2004, we see a new code that recognized women as equals, allowed divorce initiation, and to claim child custody. When we switch gears and talk about Chile, we see that the feminism emerged out of this struggle against the military dictatorship of Pinochet. And remember, Pinochet was installed with the help of the US CIA, who were opposed to Allende, who was more Marxist, socialist, being elected. So after this military dictatorship is installed, we see a feminist movement develop. Women served as human rights activists. They organized soup kitchens, craft workshops, shopping collectives in the name of economic survival for their families. We have the Watamu Sublocation Joint Women's Group, started in 2007. And again, this is to instigate development in their community. It's community-based, geared towards starting small businesses to prevent poverty and to enable them to get education for their children. Women saw the importance of educating themselves in respect to family planning and creating HIV/AIDS awareness, and that included practicing birth control methods. And so their aim is to try to get more women educated in family planning and in birth control. Orphans of family members and friends are taken in and educated at the expense of the whole group. So here we have a whole group of women who are taking care of orphans in their community. This prevents these children from having to roam the streets and fend for themselves. And at the time, I guess this would have been a year or two ago, the group at that time was currently caring for 20 orphans. They also have an agenda for conserving the environment. They started a tree planting initiative at the site of an old rubbish dump. And so here we see that, again, in Global South, much of the feminist movement is directed toward improving the community and what women can do to improve the community. So the women's question becomes a global issue, starts gaining international recognition for its view that women's rights are human rights. In other words, if women in a society have more rights, then it improves the society for everyone. And patriarchy lost some of its legitimacy during the last 100 years. The United Nations, under pressure from women activists, declared 1975 as International Women's Year and the next 10 years as the Decade for Women. They sponsored a series of world conferences on women over the next 20 years. By 2006, we have 183 nations, not the United States, but 183 nations ratified a UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And this convention was designed to promote equality, actively encourage development, and protect human rights. So again, the U.S. has not ratified that. On the screen here, we may not think at first glance it's a familiar image to us, but I think it is. This is an aspect of Brazilian feminism. This was a protest against macho culture and violence against women. This was a demonstration in Sao Paulo, Brazil. It began in 2011. And this was part of a bigger movement in 2011. This is what we may know, some of you may know, in America has been called the Slut Walk. And it was started here by Amber Rose, and she holds it every year. And these slut walks are to challenge the assumption that females who are victims of rape somehow cause those attacks because of dressing a certain way. A familiar slogan is, "My outfit is not an invitation." In other words, these protests are demonstrating or trying to demonstrate that it doesn't matter how a female dresses, it is not an invitation for sexual assault or rape. So participants marched as so-called sluts, wearing sexually provocative clothing, and this is a slut walk that took place in Sao Paulo in 2014. So just like we've seen with nationalist movements in these newly self-determining nations like in India or in South Africa, there are divisions in movements. There just are. It's very difficult to have everyone who's involved in a movement agree with one another. So there are divisions within the feminist movement. Who should speak on behalf of women at international gatherings? Who's going to have the most power? Who's going to have the most possibility to create change? Secondly, this conflict between the North and the South, the conflicts between not just the socioeconomic status, but the concerns of global North women versus the concerns of global South women are often very different. So a member of an African women's group says the following: while patriarchal views and structures oppress women all over the world, women are also members of classes and countries that dominate others and enjoy privileges in terms of access to resources. Hence, contrary to the best intentions of sisterhood, not all women share identical interests. So particularly when a woman from the global North is trying to speak for all women, that could be offensive to a woman in the global South who has entirely different agendas and entirely different things that they're fighting for. Next, third world countries' differing views. So for instance, equal inheritance. Some Muslims would oppose that in 1995 due to Islamic law requiring sons to receive 2 times that which daughters inherit. So sometimes culturally, there can be something that gets in the way of this idea of equality. Some feel that feminism undermines family life and that focusing on equal rights for women hurts families. We have here an American example. This is Phyllis Schlafly. Maybe that's how you pronounce it. She is an American opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, and we'll talk about the Equal Rights Amendment in just a couple of moments, but it's exactly what it sounds like, promoting equal rights for both genders. She considers feminism a disease that brought fear, sickness, pain, anger, hatred, danger, violence, and all manner of ugliness. So there are people, women included, who do oppose this feminist movement. Western style feminism sometimes is considered offensive in the Islamic world. Again, if we think of the traditional behaviors and dress of women in much of the Muslim world, we can imagine how offensive a slut walk might be in that arena. So the ways of defining gender equality and open sexuality of the West could be rather offensive in the Islamic world. And finally, the Vatican and sometimes the U.S. government take issue with feminist emphasis on reproductive rights. So there are controversial topics within reproductive rights discussions, like abortion, like birth control. And speaking of the Equal Rights Amendment, this is a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution stating that civil rights may not be denied on the basis of one's sex. And believe it or not, this proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution has not been ratified. We have 35 states that have approved. We see them in the darker purple there. We had a 36th state approved, Nevada, in 2017. And I am happy to say that there has been a 37th state approved the ERA in just 2018. I think it was May of 2018. So Illinois is still yellow on this slide, but it should be light purple now because they have officially approved the ERA. There are still 14 states yet to approve this Equal Rights Amendment, and Arkansas is one of them. Well, I guess 13 states now. 13 states yet to approve. And so if you're interested in trying to make a change in Arkansas on that front, then you can go to the Equal Rights Amendment website, and there are numbers that you can contact, representatives. But this is currently where we stand today with the ERA, with the exception of Illinois, who has now approved. One more to go. Illinois ratifies Equal Rights Amendment. And this was more than 40 years after this image we see on the screen of about 10,000 people marching on the Capitol building to urge approval. So 40 years later, we see it happen in Illinois. We just need one more to go. So come on, Arkansas. You could be the last state necessary to get the ERA ratified. So we'll move this out of the way, and then we're going to move on to our discussion about globalization and religion and how they have been related and continue to be related. So we see Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam continue to spread far beyond their places of origin. Buddhist, we see meditation and yoga. So as those concepts become more popular, especially in the Western world, here in the United States, for instance, we see more of an acceptance of Buddhism. Christianity gaining some acceptance in non-Muslim Africa, South Korea, and to some extent in India. And it's even spread to 7 to 8% of the Chinese population. We know it never really got a big foothold there in East Asia. Islam in the United States is gaining ground among a substantial number of African Americans and smaller numbers of European Americans. So we see the globalization of these religions, in other words. So one response to globalization, a response to modernization, is fundamentalism. And that is a militant piety. It's defensive, it's assertive, it's exclusive, it's very much about us versus them types of conversations and actions. And we see fundamentalism take shape in every major religious tradition. So here in America, we often hear about Islamic fundamentalism, and usually associated with the word terrorist. But we have to remember that fundamentalism is in every religion. And they have a lot of perceived threats, things that are threatening to those groups. First, the realm of science in the secular world challenges the unseen realm of the spirit world. Secondly, social upheavals upset what they consider to be traditional class relationships or family or gender relationships. So part of this the sharing of cultural viewpoints can be threatening to a society, for instance, that has very strict gender roles, for feminism to become influential in those regions. Nation states that are associated with particular religions can feel undermined by a global economy and by cultures that are very alien. So an example of this could be the Islamic world feeling threatened by Western culture in some places, like when we talked about our example of Iran, for instance. And foreign influence in general, usually Westerners, involving military defeat, colonial rule in the past, being dependent economically, and just that cultural intrusion. So fundamentalists would sometimes see this as an embattled form of spirituality, a cosmic war between the forces of good and evil. Again, this is an us versus them scenario. So this alternative modernity was infused with religious values. And so these fundamentalists are using modern techniques sometimes, modern technology used to communicate their fundamentalist message, using the internet, for instance, or social media. Education and propaganda efforts, mobilizing people on behalf of the religion, political mobilization. Social welfare programs, will see a specific instance of this in just a couple of slides, of a fundamentalist group that was violent in nature in many ways, but credited with starting schools. So you see them directly benefiting the society in some ways while perpetrating violence in other ways. And again, this violence is also a part of this fundamentalism. It's considered terrorism to their opponents. Here are some examples of fundamentalism. After World War I in the United States, we see some American Protestant fundamentalists opposing liberalism or the expansion of individual rights, big government, the sexual revolution, homosexuality, and abortion rights. All of these things were considered threats to this group. And they saw the United States hovering on this edge of an abyss. One spokesman, Francis Schaeffer, according to him, the West was about to enter an electronic dark age in which the new pagan hordes, with all the power of technology at their command, are on the verge of obliterating the last strongholds of civilized humanity. A vision of darkness lies before us. As we leave the shores of Christian Western man behind, only a dark and turbulent sea of despair stretches endlessly ahead, unless we fight. So here we see this desperation that's inherent in this message, and the only option given is to fight against it. At first, they sought to separate themselves, but from 1970s on, they decided to enter the political arena as the religious right. And we should be familiar with the concept of a religious right in American political life. Now, that's not to say that all people who identify as being part of the religious right are fundamentalists. Many are, but not all. So it's not a blanket statement that we can make. Second example would be in India. Sorry for the pronunciation. Hindutva, which is Hindu nationalism. And this took shape in the 1980s. The concept first appeared in 1923, and Gandhi had been assassinated by a man who was part of this movement in 1948. So the people who were a part of this form of Hindu nationalism viewed India as a Hindu land that was being overrun by Muslims, by the Christian British, and they resented this secular state of post-independence. So we see the BJP, a popular party of this movement. They're made up of urban middle class or upper caste, and they resented the state's efforts to, in their opinion, to cater to the Muslims, the Sikhs, and the lower castes. And so again, they were Hindu nationalists, a fundamentalist, extremist group in favor of Hindu rights at the expense of other groups who were living in India. And they did gain political success. They got a sweeping victory in 2014 national elections. So as far as creating Islamic societies. We've already talked about some of the differing viewpoints in the Islamic world, where we have a nation like Turkey, who is more westernized, the more secularized, versus Iran, which is more traditionally Islam and following the code of Sharia, for instance. So by the 1970s, there had been a lot of disappointments in the Islamic world, some including conquest and colonial rule, being ruled by others. This awareness of this huge gap in both technology and in wealth between Islamic civilizations and European civilizations. The disappearance of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, which had been the long-time chief Islamic state. There was more and more of a fascination with Western culture globally. And in some places, like we saw in Turkey, Islam was more in the private realm. So the presence of Islam was still there, but it was not a part of the state. We had a more secular state. Also, we see that political independence for former colonies gave rise to some states that pursued more Western secular policies within the Muslim world, like Egypt, for instance, or Pakistan. Even so, it was still overcrowded. There were few services, widespread unemployment, lots of corruption, slow economic growth, gap between rich and the poor, and what they considered foreign intrusion. So again, if you did your Arab-Israeli conflict packet, this should be familiar to you, but Israel was reestablished as a Jewish state in the center of the Islamic world in 1948. In 1967, Israel defeated Arab forces in that Six-Day War, and they seized various Arab territories, including Jerusalem. Western culture persisted and gained more of a presence in secular schools. We see examples of what was considered Western culture in alcohol, Barbies, European and American movies, and women who were dressing less traditionally. And Tunisia's leader, a secular leader on TV, was even seen drinking orange juice during Ramadan, during fasting, discouraging the veil, polygamy, and again, discouraging fasting during Ramadan. So we see this Islamic alternative to the Western model of what it is to be modern. First of all, the Quran and the Sharia were to be a guidebook for all of life, political, economic, and spiritual. So remember, the Sharia is that law code that's not just civic, but also religious as well. It's tied together. The view that departing from Islamic principles led to the decline of the Islamic world and being subordinate to the West. So in other words, veering away from a more fundamental Islam led to its downfall. And the concept of jihad, or struggle or striving to please God, became seen as more and more of an answer. This included defense against Western aggression and efforts to Islamize Muslim countries' social and political life. So jihad, that meaning of Muhammad of an inward struggle, an inward fight, became expressed more as an outward struggle and fight against Western, what they viewed as Western aggression. So we have an Egyptian leader of this Islamic alternative movement describing what he witnessed when he visited the United States in the late 1940s. Look at this capitalism with its monopolies, its usury, at this individual freedom devoid of human sympathy and responsibility for relatives except under force of law, at this materialistic attitude which deadens the spirit, at this behavior like animals which you call free mixing of the sexes, at this vulgarity which you call emancipation of women, at this evil and fanatical racial discrimination. So next I'm going to play you a video clip that has to do with Western culture and toys for children in the Islamic world. So let me get the right video here. We'll slide it over.
Ghazal is happy to buy a Barbie doll for her birthday. But the Iranian government is not happy with Barbie dolls and other Western toys flooding their market. In an official letter this April, Prosecutor General Ghurban Ali Durina-Javabadi complained to Vice President Parviz Davoudi of their destructive cultural and social impact. He said, quote,
"The displays of personalities such as Barbie, Batman, Spider-Man, and Harry Potter, as well as the irregular importation of unsanctioned computer games and movies, are all warning bells to officials in the cultural arena. Undoubtedly, the personality and identity of the new generation has been put at risk and caused irreparable damages."
Authorities tried to confiscate Barbie dolls from toy stores in 2002, but they couldn't stem the Barbie tide. In the same year, the Ministry of Education introduced Dara and Sarah. Unlike Barbie, they promote traditional values and wear modest clothes. But Iran is not alone. Saudi Arabia banned Barbie dolls in 2003, saying, quote, "Their revealing clothes and shameful postures, accessories, and tools are a symbol of the decadence of the perverted West." Even Russia tried to ban Barbie the same year. Its Ministry of Education feared that Barbie, quote, "was seen as promoting sexual awareness to too young an audience, presented girls with an unrealistic body type to emulate, and inspired materialistic desires that were unattainable for the majority of the Russian girls." Washingtonian Tunushree Jaggi grew up with Barbie, but she disapproves of the doll.
It's reflective of kind of Americans' overly obsessed kind of passion for sexualized toys for children. I don't think it's the government's role to be banning. I think it's parents' responsibility to decide what does go in and out of their children's lives. I think there's bigger fish to fry than Barbie. I think there are lots of other things: the economy, healthcare, education.
In much of the Arab world now, the alternative to Barbie doll has been Fulla. She has an accessory that Barbie lacks, a pink prayer rug. Fulla has taken the Arab market by storm for a fraction of the Barbie price. And for now, kids in Iran, like this one, get to enjoy their prized Western toys while they're still around.
شبیه بتمن با دشمنش مبارزه میکنه. مبارزه کردن همون جنگ دیگه تو خونه خوده.
All right. So from that video clip, we can see that there's reaction in Iran against some of these toys that are viewed as sexualized toys for young children like Barbie, and we saw some alternatives like Sarah and Dara and Fulla, who hold more of a traditional viewpoint for the children of Iran. And if we look at another reaction, not necessarily against Barbie, but another option for little girls who are Muslim and want a Barbie doll, then we have the example of this female entrepreneur that you see on the screen here. And again, I'm going to play the video clip of her doll, but we can already tell that these are dolls that wear the hijab, and they became pretty well known on social media, and people started calling them hijabis instead of Barbie, obviously because they wear the hijab. So we will play that video, the story of this female entrepreneur from Nigeria. Whoop, maybe. There we go.
For some, toys aren't strictly meant for child's play, but a means to tell a story. We head to Lagos to meet one woman who's reimagining a familiar doll to fit a new narrative.
There's a new wave of the appreciation for culture now, and that is what I try to incorporate with all my art and expression. Hi, my name is Hanifa Adam, and this is my Africa.
For 25-year-old Hanifa Adam, a childhood toy became a big opportunity.
For Hijabi, I was going through Barbie style page, and I decided to use a scarf around a Barbie doll because there is Barbie on our page having a very nice time with a lifestyle documentation, and I decided to do something similar that is closer to my identity.
More than 4 decades after Mattel introduced the first black Barbie, Hanifa decided it was time for a Muslim Barbie.
I live in Ilorin, and it's kind of like a close-knit community where I'm from.
I came here to look for body forms, like a body form that I can take patterns and make the dress on, and I couldn't find them. They only have mannequin. Hopefully I can come back and they will have some available. Will it be soft so that I can pin fabrics on it?
Her hometown, Ilorin, is home to around 800,000 people, most of them Muslims.
It's really important to realize who we are and to appreciate our different cultural and religious backgrounds. There are a lot of Muslim girls that are being criticized or are being attacked because of this scarf around their head. And Hijabi, the project, will just provide a more positive narrative for the Muslim girl.
And while Hijabi was an idea born out of chance, it did not go unnoticed.
I think I've been blogging about hijabi for about 2 to 3 months, and then I got an interview request from mic.com. Then the publishing of the interview came out at the time Barbie was introducing new diverse dolls to their range of dolls. There was curvy Barbie, there was tall Barbie, but there was no Barbie with hijab, so I created the Barbie with the hijab.
Her posts on Instagram went viral in January of 2016. Now she's got just over 78,000 followers on the platform.
I was able to express myself through social media and have a lot of people appreciate it. And social media has this really huge advantage of you being in a corner of the world and getting the whole world to see what you create. You don't need to physically move yourself to the hub of where everything is happening.
Yeah, something flags are there.
Oh, when it does at the end of this market, we just come like this. Usually you will see facing this market. You will see up.
Thank you very much. But I really like this fabric. I'm picking this one with this white one.
I choose my fabric sometimes based on the texture, because when you're working on a full-grown human being, it's different from when you're working on a doll. So you need the fabric to be softer and thinner. I don't want to use a very thick material because the dresses I'm going to make are very tiny.
This one is actually really nice.
The colors also inspire me. I love combining the colors and working with them and creating an outfit and a story and just publishing it online.
And while she hasn't had any formal training, her artistic eye has taken her far.
I have a master's degree in pharmacology and drug discovery, but some opportunities presented themselves through my artistic expression. I use food to create artworks themselves, Nigerian food, just to celebrate the culture. I've been expressing artworks on Instagram for a while now, so I've been able to sustain myself through it and develop business strategies with them.
But no strategy was lucrative enough to please her folks.
My parents didn't immediately appreciate the fact that they invested so much in my education. I went to Coventry University in the UK, and that cost a lot of money. I came back home and said I'm not using the certificate for now. My parents are both PhD holders, so it was really funny that I did not want to get my own PhD. But they are very supportive now, they understand more, and so far it makes me happy and I can sustain myself with it, then they are okay with it.
With Nigeria on board with her dolls, Hanifa is drawing up plans to take Hijabi abroad.
I see Hijabi developing into a global brand that has force to be reckoned with. I want to see them in retail outfits around the world. I'm working towards that and hopefully hoping for the best.
I first came into contact with opera
All right, so that is Hanifa's story as an entrepreneur in Nigeria. So designed by Hanifa in May of 2017, and Mattel decides to release a hijab-wearing Barbie on November of 2017. I'm not sure if they were competing against one another or if they compensated her for the idea. I'm not sure about the intricacies of that story of how Mattel decided to release their hijab-wearing Barbie a few months later. That'd be interesting to find out, though. But that is Hanifa's story. Okay, so results of the Islamic alternative: becoming more religiously observant, voluntary, modest Islamic dress and veil, Sufi practices increasing, and more Islamic rhetoric in government. So remember, this is fundamentalist Islam, an attempt to make a more sacred state versus a secular state. So we have President Sadat of Egypt, the believer president. He referred to the Quran and proudly displayed his prayer mark in the 1970s. In the 1980s, in Sudan, we see some Quranic punishments for crimes, including amputating the hands of thieves and banning alcohol, dumping thousands of bottles of beer and wine into the Nile. In 1992, the Algerian Islamic Salvation Front was poised to win elections there, but the frightened military government intervened to cancel those elections, and that led to a decade of civil war, since there was about to be an elected Islamic party in Algeria. And Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood came to power peacefully in 2012, but was removed by the military a year later amidst widespread protests against its policies. And to finish for today, we see the Islamic world in the early 21st century. And the Islamic world is over well over a billion people. And it incorporated much of the Afro-Asian landmass. It's divided, though, among many nations, divided along language barriers, ethnic lines as well. So we can't see the Islamic world as one uniform, identical being. There are lots of divisions, lots of differences within. We also need to keep in mind the long-term split between the Shias and the Sunnis. So if we see Muslims as a percent of the population, first of all, on this map, both of the green colors and the blue mean that 50% or more of the population are Muslim, whereas orange, yellow, and pale peachish would be less than 50%. As far as the divide in the Muslim world, 83% of the Muslim world are Sunni, whereas 16% are Shia and 1% are other. And then of the Muslim world, 20% are Arabs. And of that 20% that are Arabs, well, this is confusing phrasing. Of the Arab world, only 5% are not Muslim, but Arabs only make up 20% of the Muslim world. So in other words, there are many, many Muslims outside of the Arab world. In fact, the majority of the Muslims in the world come from Indonesia or the Spice Islands. And that is where we are going to stop for today.